Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School, the Lubar Center. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. And today we're doing something a little bit different. This event is co-hosted by Boswell Books, our friends Daniel and the gang. And in fact, you will see Daniel just a little bit later in this conversation. He'll be asking some of your questions of our guest today. And I'd like to introduce our guest. He is Jarrett Adams. Mr. Adams is an attorney. He is the owner and proprietor of his own law firm, which began in 2017. He practices in state and federal courts. In fact, he just sat down after handling another matter in court today. He is also the author of this new book. It's called Redeeming Justice: From Defendant to Defender, My Fight for Equity on Both Sides of a Broken System. This memoir tells the story of Mr. Adams' remarkable journey. He was just 17 years old when he was sentenced by an all-white jury in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, for a crime he did not commit. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, 10 of which he served. While he was in prison, he began studying the law, and after the Wisconsin Innocence Project helped him gain his release, he went back to college, went on to get his law degree from Loyola University, and today he has his own law firm. So first of all, Attorney Adams, welcome. Congratulations on this powerful book. Why did you write it?
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for having me. Marquette Law, which I am very fond of. And I spoke a couple of times through law school in Judge Nancy Joseph in her summer institute. So I'm very fond of Marquette Law. And also Boswell, I have to thank you guys for getting involved in promoting the book as well, and just encouraging folks to read, not just my book, but just books in general. Well, Mike, I guess the answer to that question is basically to use some of what you started off with, in that I just came from court now. And the scary thing is that I am seeing the same things that plagued, my mother, myself, while we're going through this system, and they're playing out again 2 decades later. And I thought once I got this law degree, I thought that I would be able to use it like He-Man's shield or something, right? And be able to just swing it, and justice would follow. But I realized very shortly after doing this that this is not going to work with one person, one law degree. It's not going to work. All hands must be on deck. And so I thought about how I would write this book, and how I would write the book would be in a fashion in which, how do I make you close your eyes and not see, but just hear and feel the pain and agony of what it's like, especially as an African-American, to go through the criminal justice system. And so I wrote the book from a perspective of everyone has a mother, everyone has an aunt, everyone has used the excuse, I'm going over this friend's house, and then you end up at a party or something like that, right? Everyone has, but not everyone is called boy during the interrogation, and then you're charged as a man, and you're called the 3 men from Chicago the rest of the entirety of the trial. That's where I wrote the book, Mike.
You say in this book, a word that stayed with me was, you used the word disposable, that we treat Black men, people of color, as disposable.
I want you to think about this. Think about what we see right now today. Police interactions, normal interactions, ending in death, where many of them are unarmed and just displaying frustration, right? And that frustration is always labeled aggressiveness, aggression, danger. And when they lose their life, what's the template response that's always used? I fear for my life. So you got to understand, what does that derive from? That derives from the history and the historical depiction of Black men as being scary figures. So when you use the defense, I fear for my life, you make people have a false sense of understanding. And that is all a part of this book. And the theme is because I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I appreciate the opportunity to be loved, for people to learn my journey. but I don't want people to be impressed upon what I've done without me impressing upon you that there are a number of people that we're losing out on contributions because we have a system that's eating people up like Pac-Man with very little justice being delivered in our court systems.
Yeah, you've said, Attorney Adams, that there's essentially two criminal justice systems. What are those systems as you see it?
What you can afford and what you cannot, or what I can say is what you can afford and what you can least afford, if I can put it that way. I'll tell you a story. So when I got to Green Bay Correctional Facility, I was about 4 years in, and it's like, this is with law students, so you can understand what I'm saying. It's like the light popped on, right? In terms of the reading, the understanding, what's important. Back then we were shepherdizing in the law library, if you believe that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I started to talk to people and started to help them with their cases because I was a GED tutor inside the prison. And I would often help men with like sentence modifications, things like that, restitution and stuff like that. And I started to see a theme of young Black guys who had pled guilty, not because they were guilty, but because they were tired of sitting at the House of Corrections. In the end, once they get on parole, their life is on layaway now. And now they're back, they're in, they're out, they're in. I remember asking this one guy, I said, look, you just left in the wintertime. Like, what are you doing back here? And he looked at me with a straight face and he said, fool, you think I like selling drugs? I can't go to school because the Grad Plus loans aren't for people who have a felony for drug conviction. So he said, they told me I was selling drugs and doing wrong, put me in prison, told me don't do it again. And when I come out to try to find another angle, you tell me I can't get money like everyone else because I have this felony. And it was so eye-opening to me.
I want to spend the next 20 or 25 minutes talking about your journey, because it is, as I said, it is a remarkable story, powerful story, disturbing story in some respects. Take us back to 1998. You're a 17-year-old guy with a couple of buddies, and you decide to go to UW Whitewater, where they're having a party. Tell us about that night.
So we use a classic alibi excuse, right? I told my mother I was spending the night over my friend's house, and they told their moms that they were spending the night over my house. We all did that because we knew good and well our parents was not going to agree to letting us go an hour and a half to a party in Wisconsin, especially named Whitewater. Okay, so we make it up to this party. And there are parties all across this dorm room. Like there people in this room, people in that room. And so we are nothing more but 2-3 kids joining in on the fun and festivities. We were in a room playing video games. And it was like the central room, a guy named Sean DeMaine. And these two young ladies walk into the room and they're having conversations with my 2 friends. I'm playing the video games with Sean DeMaine at the time. And I mentioned all of this in the book. And they invite us up to this room, and I would later join. And this was a consensual encounter. And it was embarrassing because her roommate walked in. That started an argument. And the argument went like, why are you on my bed with these Black guys? That argument spilled outside to the smoking area. But that smoking area and that visit saved our life, because I didn't know then that I would never be believed just because of how I look. So we're down in the smoking area after this walk-in by the roommate, along with our accuser. And Sean DeMaine is down there, the guy we were playing video games with, the guy who overheard the invitation for us to come up. So we ended up leaving about an hour and a half, 2 hours later. Left part ways with the young lady. Me and my friends, we get back in the car. We leave around 2:30 or something like that. We make it back to the truck stop and have some of the worst pancakes ever at the truck stop. We make it back home. We're 7 o'clock back at home doing chores, nothing. I'm getting ready to start junior college. It is the end of the summer. I've worked a job. I come home. There's a card in my door. and the card is from an officer and it said robbery, homicide. I immediately was concerned and called and said, look, I'm not sure what Jarrett Adams y'all looking for, but I can tell you this one, you most certainly are not. And the police officer says, well, look, you're right. Why don't you come on down? Your name came up. We don't know why, but we want to just take a picture of you and clear your name because you've never been arrested before or any trouble. So I said, well, look, my mom isn't coming home until, they said, well, look, you're just coming on down here to take a picture. Michael, I went down there and I was interrogated as a 17-year-old. And I thought that telling the truth, because that's how we were raised. I don't have a story of being in the streets and we're doing drive-bys and gang banging and drug dealing. Like I had, a grandmother who was about 4'9" and she did not play any games. Okay. If the police or the school came to that door, you were going to feel her wrath. So we just stayed out the way as a result of that as kids. So it was shell shocking. We didn't know what to do. I go in this police station and I just think that if I tell the truth, if I do the right thing, it'll be okay, because that's what they kept telling me. But literally, when I left the conversation, first of all, they were trying to get me to implicate my friends in something that just wasn't true, because what I didn't know is that they had already had a statement that we would learn was withheld from us by Sean Demain. They had already had it in their possession the day after this false allegation. So they kept trying to explain why I went up the stairs staggeredly, why I went because little did I know, Michael, that the actual allegation that was written on the police report was like a scene from a movie. It said that we snuck up a flight of stairs. We suddenly appeared behind a young lady, and out of fear, she let us in her room and had a sexual encounter with us because she was scared. No one ever threatened her. No one ever forced her, none of that. So let me unwrap that. The element of force was what? Simply our presence. I never really thought about that until I started to go through the process, and until, it was in conversation with the Innocence Project and with folks who were litigating my case, that the element of force in this first-degree sexual assault that was supposed to take place was simply the presence of 3 Black men. It took a lot to digest that.
You were arrested not long after that conversation at the police station. Mm-hmm. And we will talk about your experience with the prison system and the Cook County Jail and all that in just a bit. But I want to jump ahead. So you and your 2 friends are accused of sexual assault, and you are going to stand trial in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. The case that the prosecution had obviously had problems. That was clear from the beginning. And yet it went forward. As you're sitting there in the courtroom as a defendant, what are you thinking as this case proceeds?
You know what I'm thinking about, Michael? I'm thinking about the chores that I need to do once this is over, because I had been in the county jail for 8 months. That's how assured I was that I was telling the truth. We were telling the truth, and the facts supported us. And I remember turning around, looking at my mother, and I just remember how hollow her eyes were sunk into her head, and these just deep creases of anguish on her forehead. And I said, Mom, why are you so worried? Why are you so concerned? She's like, you don't get it. And I said, I do. We're telling the truth. This is going to be okay. She said, no, baby. Emmett Till was telling the truth. There's thousands of other Black men down South who were telling the truth. This isn't about the truth. And that day in that courtroom, that innocence of Jarrett Adams, and you grew up in a cocoon as a kid. You don't really know what racism and prejudice really is until you get off the porch and experience it. But that day, after that response from my mother, I knew this was something that I had never, ever thought, would be possible. And I'm just thinking right now, as I'm recounting it, just looking at her face and how terrified she was, and how I thought it would be okay simply because I was telling the truth.
race was very much in play in this trial. You mentioned in the book the jury, for instance, all white, correct?
The only thing of color was the judge's role, the attorney's suits, and us.
And you mentioned this earlier, Attorney Adams, but I was struck by this in the book too, the way you and your friends were referred to by the prosecutor as three Black men from Chicago. It wasn't even subtle. It was not subtle.
No, not at all. I mean, and it was littered throughout, you know, my transcripts. And I'll tell you, you know, just certain steps along this way. When people read the book, it's going to keep you wanting to know what happens in the next chapter. And I wrote it like that, but that's really how it felt. You know, I remember there was an incident that took place in Waupun, and they locked everyone down. And I remember being celled up with an older white gentleman. You know, he had been in there for almost 20 years. And I remember him reading over the transcripts. And I remember him, you know, taking off work one day because he would say, look, you act like you're on a college campus. Like you go play chess, you go play basketball. You don't act like you're innocent. And I remember him, you know, one day taking off of work and waiting in the cell for me to come back from playing basketball. And he said, you know, I read a lot of people's paperwork. You ain't here for some racist bull crap. And you're playing basketball, you're playing chess. You're going to keep on. And you're going to mandatory release out of here, you know, with you know, Hall of Fame basketball, you know, stats. Is that what you want? Or do you want to prove your innocence? And he pointed out certain things. And he also pointed out the mention of Sean DeMaine. At that time, Michael, we only knew Sean DeMaine was just a student that was talked to. We didn't know any significance or anything that he had to offer at all. So I started to write letters. And at a certain point, our trials were like bifurcated. They were severed, right? Because me and one co-defendant had panelist attorneys. We didn't have public defenders, not the public defender's office. They were attorneys on a panel in Jefferson and in Watertown and all of those other ones. And so my co-defendant who had enough resources to hire an attorney, they filed motion after motion after motion after there was a mistrial. I want to like make sure I'm following people on this. There was a mistrial in my case because our accuser did not testify to what the police wrote in the statement. So they tried to amend the charges from first degree down to like third and fourth at the end of trial. And Boyle, Gerald Boyle was the attorney for my co-defendant who could afford an attorney. And I remember him just springing out of his seat like a jack in the box. And he had just lost it. He was just like, look, I've been quiet this entire time watching them play this race-based case, and enough is enough. This is double jeopardy. They're trying to redo a case where they know that they're filling in the facts with race. And the judge declared a mistrial. And that changed the trajectory of me and Dimitri's life instantly and forever. 6 months later, there was supposed to be the second trial. Michael, we get to trial and we're looking around the room.
So they charged you again. I'm not charged you again, but they decided to come back at it again. The prosecution in Jefferson County said, well, that may have been a mistrial with prejudice, but we've decided we're going to pursue it again, correct? So
the court declared it a mistrial without prejudice.
Without prejudice, sir.
So that allowed them to bring the charges again. Yep. And in Boyle's, I've never heard this phrase before until I heard Boyle say it, but now I say it today. He says, Your Honor, they're trying to get a second kick at the cat. Right? Like that's what he said. So we get to the second trial and Boyle's not there. Our co-defendant isn't there. And the attorneys, we're asking questions. And I remember them saying, hey, come on, let's go out in the hall and talk for a second. For you all who aren't attorneys right now, if a lawyer ever says, come on, let's go out in the hall and talk for a second, look, the conversation isn't going to go well, okay? Nothing good is going to come out of that. So we're talking to these lawyers and they're telling us, hey, this motion was filed and, you know, we could go ahead and proceed on because you saw what happened at the last trial and, you know, we think we have this in the bag and, you know, just a bunch of stuff. And in my heart of hearts, I knew that from the first trial, Boyle was the lead attorney doing most of the work. And I should have not agreed to not join in that motion, but it was sprung upon us. And at the time that it was done, I'm looking across at my mother and I'm just sick of her driving 5 hours for court dates. And I just wanted it to stop. I wanted it to stop.
So your attorney was advising you, we will use a no defense strategy. It's clear that the testimony is flawed. The jury will see that, and they will come to a conclusion quickly that this didn't happen, and you'll be able to go home. That was essentially the thinking, correct?
That was the thinking. And let me say this, I've spent a lot of time on thinking about this. On the one hand, I was furious that any attorney, especially now that I am an attorney, right? I was furious that any attorney would commit to a strategy without first investigating. And that is the Strickland versus Washington standard through and through. You can't commit to a trial strategy without first investigating. And so I was furious. But when he told me his reasons, I read a little deeper into it. So he says more than just no defense theory. He's like, look, the burden is theirs to prove. You heard this outlandish testimony. Who's going to believe any of this? You know, because at a certain point, we were supposed to have been doing the gang rape, took a halftime break, and then kept doing the gang rape after, the roommate, walked in. So I got where he was coming from because it was just so far-fetched that you wouldn't think anyone would believe it. But what he didn't appreciate was, again, this isn't a race card being laid. This is reality. Like, we have an issue with our jury system, with our criminal justice system, with the fairness throughout. So when he's putting me and thinking about it, and I'm going in front of this jury, he's not considering that this is an all-white jury deciding the fate of 2 young Black men when there's a white accuser. So he just didn't have an appreciation for that. And I think that if he did, there's no way he would have tempted the fate of the jury to just say, well, they didn't prove it. You see, this doesn't make any sense.
How long did it take the jury to convict you and your friend?
An hour and a half. An hour and a half. Like that, I barely got lunch down with how fast. But then what reason did they have not to, when you have attorneys who didn't impeach on the inconsistencies before? Just simply, they really thought they had this in the bag based off of what happened at the first trial.
You were sentenced to 28 years in prison. Your friend was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Why did you get more time than he did from the judge?
Because true in the profession as I am in, I gotta have the last word. So it got me in trouble then, right? I just wanted my mother and my aunts to know how sorry I was. I knew I wasn't supposed to be up there, and I knew that they were protecting me from what I didn't know. And then I found out, like, this is what they were protecting me from. We don't have the presumption of innocence, and so I just felt bad. I felt bad that I had these, ladies driving all the way up here, these phone calls, these visits. I just felt bad. So I stood up in court and I said, look, I want to apologize to everyone in this courtroom, especially, my family, but I'm not apologizing for a rape that didn't happen. It simply didn't happen. The judge came in and it was like, look, I'm getting ready to lay down the sentence, and Mr. Henley, yours is 20 years. And Mr. Adams, yours was initially 20 years, but I gave you an additional 8 years because you weren't remorseful. You aren't remorseful. And so I didn't think that was legal, but apparently it was. And I got an additional 8 years because of it.
Part of the criminal justice system is something we talked about a bit earlier, and that is the corrections system, what we do with people who are convicted of crimes. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that with you. You had different experiences. The Cook County Jail initially, after you were arrested, in the state of Wisconsin, Waupun, the Supermax facility at Boscobel, the Green Bay prison. Help people understand what life was like in those institutions.
Yeah. I want you to think about something that you haven't worn in a while that's hanging up in your closet. And then when you go in there looking for something, you're like, damn, I forgot I even had this sweater, right? That's exactly what it's like. It's just, you just sitting there, warehoused, hanging, stored. It has nothing to do with corrections at all. And it's sad because 90% of the people who are incarcerated will come home one day. It's a very small percentage of folks who are committed to prison for life or on death row. And so it's a feeder system that's happening. The impoverished communities of color are feeding the prison, and the prison in turn is feeding the impoverished areas of color with ill-prepared men and increasingly women that have been well housed for decades. Just look at the Wisconsin system. There are people right now who are writing me, asking for my help that I was locked up with, and they were incarcerated with non-fatal offenses. One of which was a marijuana dealer who happened to have a gun in a closet upstairs. So now where you can sell marijuana and it's everywhere for free and legal, he's sitting in prison, like a number of other people with marijuana associated offenses. And I just can't stress how we aren't locking our way up out of this. It's not happening. It's been long thought that tough on crime and all of this could possibly deter. This is simply not happening. The only way that we dig our ways out of this is by providing a ladder of resources to the communities that I just talked to you about, that are feeding people and being fed.
You said when you were in prison, your goal was to stay safe and stay sane. How did you stay sane?
I gotta tip my cap to my mom and my aunts. I mean, they came from down south Mississippi, so they had a different type of toughness and resolve, right? That I'd never, experienced or saw before. And what they would do is they would do a staggered approach. One would send me a letter on one day, the other would send me a letter on another day. And I remember my aunt getting me a subscription to the Chicago Tribune. And I asked her, I said, Aunt, look, why are you paying so much for this? Because it comes 2 days late, like, what are you doing? She was like, it's two reasons why I'm doing it. She said, number one, have you noticed a lot of the names in the neighborhoods that you grew up? I said, yeah. She says, look, while you fighting in there, you better believe it's a fight out here as well too. So she's like, you're not, you're in there, but there's stuff going on out here. Like my friends were getting indicted. These are people who I know aren't able to afford their own underwear, but they're getting indicted under kingpin statutes and being sentenced to prison for 300 months in federal prison and being portrayed as like big time drug dealers. And so she also told me this, which I'll never forget. She says, they have your body and you got to acknowledge that, but you can't ever allow them to incarcerate your mind. So you have to continue to read. You have to continue to prepare and exercise each day as if you're going to come home the next. And so I psychologically made myself believe or forced myself to believe that just hang on for one more day. And after that day ended, hang on for one more.
When you were at Waupun, you spent a lot of time in the law library. Mm-hmm. What was it about the law that intrigued you, that interested you?
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you some great answer about my appreciation and all of this. Look, Michael, I wanted my lick back. You understand? My mother, I was hearing from friends, she wasn't going to church anymore because she got tired of people asking, where's Jarrett at? How's he doing? No one listens to you past, he's incarcerated, right? So part of my mission and my goal was to learn this, to both put myself in this position and keep other young Jarrett Adams and Lois Adams from being in that position. And that's some of what I'm doing right now, which goes back to the first question. That is the reason why I wrote the book. You don't get rich off writing books. I'm gonna tell you right now. I don't know who's an author who's watching this, but y'all probably like, you are right, Mr. Adams, because you don't. Like, you actually do more work writing a book, doing speaking events and stuff like that. But I am calling on the cavalry with this book. That's what I'm calling on. We have to have, every law school should have a course on a conversation like this, Michael. If you don't have one, you need to have one, right? Because how else do you encourage the next generation to tackle the issues that are still going to be around, that I pray that when I am 75, 80, God willing, I get to that point, I pray that this next generation that is on right now, the law students right now, are finishing that torch across the line to true equality, to true justice, to true reform. And you can't get to any of the latter without equality, diversity, and diversified minds as well. Not just how people look, but how people think, Michael. And that's why law schools are so important with the curriculums that they have and the conversations that they have.
And I'm going to transition here in a moment, but one of the, I guess, lighter moments in the book was when you were in prison in Waupun. You began to develop a reputation as someone who was knowledgeable about the law. You earned a nickname, and that sort of became your reputation. That was your reputation. Tell folks about that.
So I was helping this guy. He had got like rule infraction. So under the old law, when you got a rule infraction, you would lose good time. Like you could lose good time and stuff like that when you got disciplinary infractions inside of the institution. So a lot of guys, a lot of African-American men inside the institution, they would break off the tip of their shavers or state issue shavers because it wouldn't shave you. It would pull hairs out. And African-American men have curly hair, would develop like these ingrown hairs. And so people would break that off just to get a close shave. So let me tell you this one thing about prison as well, and segregation and bed space. Prisons cannot operate without someone being in segregation, okay? Because segregation holds bed space. Right now, the Wisconsin prison system, even back then, is overswelling. Somebody's gonna be in segregation, right? Just like, people driving. Do you think someone's not gonna get a driving ticket? Someone's gonna get a driving ticket. So in this instance, people were pleading guilty, losing good time and going to the hole based on these manufacturing, producing of a weapon. So I started to litigate those things and argue those things on behalf of inmates. And just like our criminal system, if people decided right now today, everybody wanted a trial, the system would collapse. It wouldn't be able to furnish all of these criminal trials. So when I started to do this, I started to become successful, like with some of them. And then I remember one day, the guy was like, this one guy was talking to the guy I helped, and he was like, man, how'd you get out of that, man? I'm trying to get home. They keep pushing my day. He was like, dude, down on the first, he was like, what dude on the first floor? He was like, the little Johnny Cocker looking motherfucker with the glasses on down there on the first floor. So I that was exactly how he said it. So I apologize for our folk on here and using that language, but it stuck, Michael. So when I got to a different prison in Green Bay, people were coming up to me. They didn't know my name at all. They were just like, that's a little Johnny Cochran looking dude from, and I'm like, who is that? Like, and that's how it continued to just roll along.
I want to talk about how you were able to finally put this behind you. And you had been writing letters to attorneys, trying to get their attention. There had been unsuccessful appeals waged on your behalf by your then attorneys. But you finally heard from the Wisconsin Innocence Project. They responded to one of your letters. Describe for us their role in securing your eventual release.
So it was, they were huge, but they're backlogged. And so it took them a while to get to me. But before I got to them, I have to send a shout out to an attorney by the name of Robert Hennick. Right. I saw Robert Hennick in the newspaper. He was doing an argument. I wrote him a letter. I couldn't afford him. My mom had exhausted 401k, couldn't afford him at all. So I wrote him a letter and I said, look, I have a habeas that I've been drafting because I had my eye on this deadline. So, and I was going to have to file pro se. So I asked him, I said, look, would you agree just to edit it, for me? And, you don't have to like do all the work. And to my shock, he responded and said, sure, gave me out like this is, what I'll take me out, so we sent a couple thousand and Michael, I knew I sent off the best habeas ever. Man, I think the only thing that wasn't scratched out was the caption. Okay. It was like Jarrett Adams versus whatever. And so I said, there's a lot of learning that I have to do. And so I took that and started attaching it to letters and attaching it to folks. I got the call from the Innocence Project. I mean, let me tell you how scary it is. The habeas deadline, ADEPA, right, controls the habeas deadline. You have 1 year once your appeals are exhausted. And here's the concerning thing about that. When your state appeals are exhausted, no attorney is afforded to you. So you have to do it on your own at a much harder scale of the federal courts in a habeas petition. So you only have a year. So I was terrified that I would mess it up. So I was drafting this entire year, but still writing people. I would do legal work for people who had typewriters and tell them, type this up, I'll do your legal work, or give me some stamps and I'll do your legal work. And the funny thing is, you could get 25 bags of chips, of potato chips, out of canteen every week, but you could only get 10 stamps. Now, does that make any sense? But that's how they had it set up. So I finally get the response back from the Innocence Project, and it's literally 2 weeks to my deadline, or probably a little less than then. They take the case, they take what I had put together, and they put together their habeas, and they include the argument about the ineffective assistance of counsel. Like, that was my biggest argument that I felt like would win, because it's very rare for you to have the second prong already established, which is, would it have effectuated a different outcome? Well, we knew that because the statement, when it came out, resulted in my co-defendant's case being immediately dismissed. So I just a bundle of nerves just with this deadline, and just, man, did they get it in? Did they, are they going to mess around and say that it was 1 day late or 2 days? Is it a leap year? Like, Michael, I could not sleep, thinking about this. And they finally took it, and I got a chance to be represented by Keith Finley and a host of amazing law students.
Madison, we should say, yeah. Madison.
Yeah, out of Madison, Wisconsin. Absolutely, the Wisconsin Innocence Project.
And eventually, and I say eventually because not initially, but eventually their arguments paid off. The arguments of both insufficient evidence and ineffective counsel paid off, and the charges were dismissed. But I want to talk about the transition back to regular life after prison, but there was a moment in this book that jumped out at me, and that is, you wanted to be in the courtroom when they finally dismissed the charges against you.
Yeah.
It was the same judge who sentenced you to 28 years in prison. What did she say to you? Was there any sort of apology? Was there any sort of statement that we're sorry that this has taken 10 years of your life? What happened?
Michael, that hearing was as quick as I wished my other hearings go when I go to court now, okay? Like, that's how fast it ended. It was prosecutor's motion, dismissing the charges. All right, okay, good. Bam, slam of the gavel, twist, turn, that was it. No acknowledgement. No acknowledgement, no anything. And I turned to that same familiar face, who was crying again, and I told her, I said, look, Mom, we done crying. We done crying. And I left out of there. I immediately enrolled in junior college. And shortly after enrolling in junior college, I started to take therapy, because I needed to compartmentalize what had happened, to me, because, I was on autopilot trying to catch up with years that I would never be able to catch up with. I don't think people could ever have the appreciation or the gut-wrenching feeling of meeting your niece and nephew, and they don't know whether to shake your hand or give you a hug because they don't know you.
And you know what? I think the transition from prison back into normal life, not enough is talked about with that. We had a gentleman here at the law school a few years ago, Professor Bruce Western. He's at the Justice Lab at Columbia University, written a book called Homeward, and it looked at the year after a number of people have been released from prison. What happened? And it's pretty depressing. And I think initially, you write in the book, it was that way for you too. It was really a struggle to return to some semblance of normalcy.
It was a struggle, and it didn't make sense because so I'm in a gray area, Michael. Like, okay, I'm not a convict because I don't have a record, right? I don't have a felony record. But even though that case and that conviction was reversed and sent back to its beginning stages, Jarrett Adams could never be sent back to the 17, 18-year-old on his way to junior college. It can't happen. And so when I got out, I remember trying desperately to catch up. I went in, there was no Google. So when I got out, I'm looking for payphones. With no payphones around, right? Back in 1998, people had pagers. Yes, law students right now today, people had actual pagers where they would be paged, or if you wanted to find someone, you had to go look and see their car parked out front or their bike out front. But like, so it just was a learning curve that was terrifying. And I remember getting in a program that teaches people how to, resume building and stuff like that. And this lady who ran the program she was just so nice, so warm, like, and I remember her calling me into the office after like the second day. And she's like, look, I don't even know how to tell you this. And I'm like, what's going on? She says, well, our grant money is tied to the heads of convicted offenders that we help. You don't have a conviction technically, so we can't account for you for like the resources that we're using. And I'm like, it's shocking, and that is that gap that people who are exonerated are in. I have never been compensated. The state of Wisconsin denied me the state compensation, and their cap for compensation is $25,000 max, no matter what. And their standard is absolute innocence. How do you even get to absolute innocence when in the first place things were an absolute lie?
And people don't think about the still very important things, like you said that you were listed, you were on the sex offender list, that you had to get that removed too, and that some people might not even think about that or know about that, but yet that was following them along after their release.
Let me tell you one more other thing too that was happening that I didn't know until I didn't know this until after. So once I started in school and I started to get ready to go to law school, I was living in a rough area, and it just was bad in this area. I would have to get off the bus and the train at night, and they would be robbing and shooting and stuff like that. And so I was desperately trying to move closer to the law school because I knew I wasn't going to be the smartest person in school, but nobody was going to ever outwork me. So I planned to be in the law library till it closed. And so I knew I needed to move. So I started to apply for different places and stuff like downtown area around the school. And it would start off great. They would take the deposit and then they couldn't offer it. And I didn't know what was going on. And one lady came to me because she had saw me do like some event in Chicago where I was talking about my case. She says, Mr. Adams, did you know that when we do a credit report, your last known address is a Supermax in Wisconsin called Boscobel? I had no idea, like no idea. And, that's that, to your point, this is what that made me think about. So, and I read that same article and others like it, right? And it talks about how the year to 3 years, really, half of the people who are released come right back. So let me use this analogy, and I think this will get to people. Imagine if there was a car company and they produce cars, right? And on average, half of those cars came back to the production line because something was wrong with them. Congress would have a national debate, and they would have the heads of that car company in front of them answering, what the heck is going on with your cars? Why do they keep failing? Do we need to put you guys out of business or something? Because something isn't working here, and consumers are being damaged when these things are released into the community. So now I twist that. Think about the population of folks that are coming out, and within a year and a half, 2 years, they're coming back in the shape that they're being released into the community is not great in the first place. So where's the national debate to hold the Department of Corrections or any of these other institutions, accountable? Where is the conversation about shutting this thing down unless we got it right? Well, then we go back to the same conversation that we started with. And that thing is about race. Because if there was 750,000, Caucasian men incarcerated, we wouldn't, this thing would stop, wouldn't even get to that point. But because there are 750,000 men of color, it's not a pressing issue right now.
There are a lot of tough realities in your book, but I also found the book to be hopeful. Your pursuit of your dream to become a lawyer was, I think, for people who read it, a very sort of encouraging tale. What motivated you to be? You were a very good student at Roosevelt University. You were a very good student at Loyola Law School. What was driving you? What was motivating you at that moment in your life?
I could never forget, like, the embarrassment, the pain, like looking at my mom. Like when I came home, it wasn't how I left it. When I was 17, you're talking about a family who settled things over the kitchen stove, food, cookouts, backyard, get your tail in here and wash your hands. And, that's the type of family I came from. So when I get out, I'm take this dialysis treatment. I'm visiting folks who are deep in dementia, who can barely even remember me now. I'm sitting in my mother's living room. I'm thumbing through the photo album. And my photos stop after high school. Everyone else's photos continue. And mine don't start again until I'm 26, turning 27 years old at a party that my mother threw me when I awkwardly met my niece and nephew one day after my release from prison. And so, no, I didn't want to be good. I didn't want to be great. And I wanted to be astounding and also show that this was attainable to other young African-American men, because we need to figure that thing out. Until we figure out how to save, kids in the inner cities of Milwaukee from going to these juvenile detentions and pushing them through law school. See, I don't think that people really get this thing, right? So within these neighborhoods, there's a pandemic going on, right? There's a pandemic, and that pandemic is hopelessness, right? That pandemic is, well, what do I care for? I'm not gonna have the opportunity to do this. And I know some people can say, oh, well, that's a choice. Yeah, well, why don't you try putting on those systematic shoes for a little while and seeing how much of a choice it is? So our duties, our job, our goals, especially as attorneys, people who get a platform, is we're servers, Michael. Like, that's what we are. We just might have good suits on, and, lined up beards and stashes and stuff, but we are servers.
Describe, this will be my final question. We'll go to Daniel for some audience questions, but describe the kind of work you're doing today. How do you decide what cases to take?
Michael, I'm tougher than a prosecutor. Okay. All right. I have a heavy screening process, and we take actual cases of innocence, but I've started, along with some other exonerated men and women, I've started a group called Life After Justice, right? It's a nonprofit, and we work on 3 important things. And the 3 important things is what got me here today, right? Number 1, mental health care. I just cannot stress enough how until we bridge the gap between the criminal justice system and the mental health care system, we're like missing it. Like, we're missing that element of fix, right? Because, people come from these rough neighborhoods. Who in their right mind would believe that someone can grow up in these neighborhoods that suffer from PTSD, not persistent, not post, but persistent traumatic stress, and not have some element of that stress itself? So we have to figure that thing out. And I I don't know where I would be, because it wasn't easy for me, Michael. Like I'm literally having the conversations with my aunts, and I'm fighting with them because I felt like they were saying something was wrong with me and I didn't want to go to therapy. But I didn't know that that was exactly what I needed. You know, and you don't have to go through what I went through to need to sit down and talk to a professional. So we operate on focusing on that, as well as the actual claims of innocence. We do the actual claims of innocence, which I do, and which we're growing. Right now, we could use attorneys to do some pro bono work, and we could use some big law bucks. So if you want to bypass on Corner Bakery and send us a couple dollars to get a student and create a fellow, we will be glad to do so. And lastly, and something that law schools can most certainly pioneer is we have to start to come up with precedent statutes that are implemented that prevent these vulnerable populations of innocent people who are pleading guilty because they can't afford an attorney and stuff like that. We have to create some type of mechanism that allows our public defense system to have the resources necessary to be able to do their job. And I can't stress, like, the public defense system, especially in Wisconsin, is in desperate need of a rehaul. Public defenders carrying 50 to 75 cases. Michael, if I did that in my profession as a single attorney, I would be in front of the board of bar examiners, okay? So how don't we have that figured out and fixed? So that is exactly what I'm trying to do. You know, what I promised my mother, what I promised my aunts. My aunt that I was speaking to you about that told me about my mind being incarcerated. She was the one that I was telling you about with dementia. And, you know, she passed away, and she couldn't even really remember like who I was to celebrate the graduation. So it was tough.
Yeah. We're going to take a few questions. People who've been watching this have some thoughts. And Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. We'll bring you into the conversation. You can share those questions with Attorney Adams, and I'll let you take it away. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. We have just a couple of questions. So one of them, the funny thing about one of them is that none of the three of us can answer it. But so I'm trying to, because one of the law students said, how can we start an innocence project at Marquette? And I do know that the Wisconsin Innocence Project, as you mentioned, was run by University of Wisconsin-Madison, and yes, there are students involved. And the New York Innocence Project, which I think you've also worked with, is part of Cardozo Law School, I think.
Cardozo, yeah. Yes,
part of Yeshiva University. So my question to you is, are they state by state? Can any law school start an innocence project?
Any law school can start an innocence project. And what I'm proposing for Marquette is this. I am proposing a life after justice clinic, but we could start on the weekend, have a weekend seminar to gauge how many students are interested. Because I've had the great fortune I'm of counsel for Birdsall and Aubert. So there are students from Marquette who rotate through the office, and I have my own relationship with the law school again through Judge Joseph. So there are inboxes that I'm getting where students are like, how do we do this? So what I'm proposing is this: let's start a weekend seminar to see the gauge of what students want to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be a wrongful conviction clinic. It could be a clinic that says, what part of the criminal justice system can we tackle with life after justice? It might be policy, it might be whatever it is, but it has to, we cannot have law schools who do not have social and criminal justice programs, because if you do that, you do not prepare the next legal warriors for the battle that this country is facing.
That's great advice, and so powerful. I have another question about the judge who saw
retired.
Your case.
Everybody's retired.
Everybody, I'm sure I've already asked that.
Yeah, including the police officer. Everybody's retired.
So Deborah noted that, Kokonis noted that MU Law School has an expungement and pardon clinic in operation. So maybe they can tie in with that.
Yeah, I mean, look, that would be great. But also this, you know, there could be more than one course. I'm, you know, and I'm proposing like a weekend seminar because sometimes like it's definitely about the books. It most certainly is about the books, but it's also about the inspiration from who the person is who's leading the course and stuff like that. So it's twofold. And I really feel like this is my personal opinion about this system and about the criminal justice and reform and stuff like that. So we saw the best of this country during one of the worst times with this pandemic, right? We saw, you know, for a day, there were no mass shootings. And, you know, we saw people put down the political banter for a second and say, how do we get to this vaccine, right? That's what we need to do with this criminal justice system, because in order to beat the pandemic and beat COVID-19, we had to come up with a vaccine. What is a vaccine? A vaccine is the virus created into some form of an antibody put back into our system to fight against it. So how on earth do we plan to reform without using, you know, the folks inside of the prison who can help this younger generation who does not believe that they have a life worth living? They are our vaccine, right? How I survived, Michael, you know, in prison was I stopped hanging out with the younger crowd and was playing with men who taught me how to play chess and told me that every move was a move in life. We're missing out on something in Wisconsin because we don't parole anyone as we should. We don't prepare people as we should. We need to start to get these young kids in front of who they could be as an older man who spent 30 years in prison, to get them to recognize and realize that there's more out here than you know, a stolen vehicle, hot pursuit and stuff like that. Like, you know, the kids right now, especially as I'm learning more and more about Milwaukee and learning more and more about the structure and the families and stuff like that, Michael, Daniel, they don't want to be in the despair that they're in right now. Who thinks it's fun, you know, to be in and out of jail, can't go to the bank and get a loan and start a business, you know, your school system is poor. Look, I could just sum up what I'm saying with this. We saw a war on drugs. It ended in mass incarceration. We need to have a war on poverty, education, childcare, healthcare, right in those areas that predominantly are affected by our criminal justice system.
Absolutely, we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to pass things back to Mike Cushay to close the event.
All right, thank you very much. And I just want to wrap things up here. Thank everybody who's watching at home or wherever they may be watching today. I want to thank Daniel and the good folks at Boswell Books. And most of all, I want to thank our guest today, Jarrett Adams. Attorney Adams is the author of this book, Redeeming Justice from Defendant to Defender, My Fight for Equity on Both Sides of a Broken System. Really enjoyed the conversation, Attorney Adams. Continued success and good luck. And thanks to everyone who watched today. Thank you.
Thank you.